Good evening. I'm Charlie Firestone, Executive Director of the Communications and Society Program at the Aspen Institute. And it's my pleasure to welcome you, our listening audience on Aspen Public Radio, and our viewers on Grassroots TV. We want to thank Tom and Bonnie McCloskey and their family for the Speaker Series grant that they made to the Institute, and also Jerry and Glenda Greenwald for the gift that allowed us to build this spectacular pavilion. So it's my privilege to introduce our distinguished guest. You all know him from his 24 years as anchor of the CBS Evening News. It's the longest tenure of any anchorman in network television. During that time, when he also reported on 60 Minutes, and his 30 years as a reporter before that, he received 7 Peabody Awards. He's known, among other things, for his folksy figures of speech. My favorite, things are getting hotter than a Times Square Rolex. He's the host of a weekly investigative news show on HDNet. Now look, we're all sad for the loss of Uncle Walter Cronkite, but we still have our country cousin. Please welcome Dan Rather.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that overly generous but very much appreciated introduction. I trust all of you know what Abe Lincoln said about such introductions. Honest Abe said, "Never take time to deny it. The audience will find out the truth soon enough for themselves." And so it will be with you here. I have a lot of ground that I want to cover, including getting to your questions. I want to talk about what I consider to be the big corporatization of news, the politicalization of news, the dumbing down resulting in the trivialization of news. I want to talk some about the future, where we are and where we may be going. But you know, at my age and stage, anytime you start thinking about or talking about the future, your mind uncontrollably goes back to the past. And part of my journalistic upbringing was I worked at a 250-watt radio station in Huntsville, Texas. Huntsville is in deep East Texas in Walker County. If you've never heard of the place, well, don't be surprised. I went to what was then Sam Houston State Teachers College there. Those of us who went there knew it to be the Harvard of our part of the world. But we have always been perfectly aware that a lot of people this far north and west never heard of the damn place. It had about as much ivy on it as your average Burger King or McDonald's. But they gave me about all the education I was capable of absorbing at that time. And I was walking in this room tonight on this beautiful Colorado night in this wonderful venue, looking at this crowd and saying to myself, this is a long way from Huntsville and Walker County. There's one thing interesting about Walker County. Walker County is filled with hardworking, patriotic, very proud people. And they are proud of nothing more than the following. There is not now, nor has there ever been in Walker County, not one single intellectual. Never. And if it's any interest to you, the definition of an intellectual in Walker County was and remains, if you can listen to the William Tell Overture and not think of the Lone Ranger, you are an intellectual. And I worked at this small radio station. This was not a campus radio station. We didn't have one. This was a 250-watt AM station. AM was all anybody had in those days. That's the lowest power allowed for an FCC license. Now, I know to many of you this story is going to seem passing well strange, and you may say it's apocryphal. But as Dr. Henry Kissinger once said in another context, this story has the added advantage of being true. I had gone to Sam Houston State Teachers College hoping to play football. You know, every young male in Texas is raised with the idea, if you're able-bodied, it's not a choice. You have to be a football hero. But it was pretty obvious to me and to the football coach from the beginning that I wasn't going to get a football scholarship. So I wound up with this job at the radio station. which at that time was, and forgive my language here, was pretty much an outhouse with an antenna sticking up. But fortunately for me, it was run by the late, and I consider him great because he was so good to me, the late Pastor Lott. Now, Pastor Lott not only ran the radio station, he was, when I applied for the job, the only employee of the radio station. But he had wanted to get back in the ministry, and so he hired me at 40 cents an hour to keep his radio station on the air on Saturday and Sunday. While he did the Lord's work, I was to keep the station on the air. I was not to be an announcer once in a while, say this is KSAM or something, but basically to keep the station on the air because the FCC required that the station be on the air from 6 a.m. in the morning to midnight. So I took the job, and the very first weekend it went all right, except I came into Pastor Lott's office on Monday afternoon after my classes and said, Pastor Lott, things went all right this last weekend, but there was one problem. He wheeled around in his swivel chair and he said, hold it right there, son. If you are here to complain that your 40 cents an hour does not meet the federal minimum wage standard, I am here to tell you that federal law ain't never applied in East Texas and ain't going to start now. I said to him, well, no, Pastor Lott, that's not the problem. The problem is I get here at 6 a.m. and I leave at midnight, and you'd be surprised how few places there are open to eat in Huntsville, a town of about 2,000 after midnight. Frankly, I never starved to death. I don't know what to do. It makes me nervous. And he said, well, I got it. So we worked out the following arrangement, which may strike you as strange, but was not that uncommon. We didn't have audio tape at that time. The plan was for me every Saturday and Sunday at 6 p.m. to put on a long-playing record disc, a self-contained program. I'd start the record, get it started, and then I was to jump in the KSAM mobile unit, which was a 1937 Plymouth pickup truck. I was to drive myself down to the local Dairy Queen on Highway 75, get myself a hamburger and milkshake, and then come back to the station. This Dairy Queen wasn't far away. Well, the second weekend I worked at the station, the first time we tried this, 6 o'clock came, and I put on the program. This particular program featured Pastor Lott's itinerant preacher brother from Del Rio, Texas. He did a little guitar picking, a little scripture quoting, and a little hymn singing. I got started, I jumped in the mobile unit, I went down to the Dairy Queen, and I got a bad break. There was a new freshman girl working at the Dairy Queen whose acquaintance I had not really been able to develop very far. And so I got my hamburger, my milkshake, and said, it doesn't make any difference whether I eat it here, eat it back at the station, as long as I get back before this program is over. So she and I sat there while I ate my hamburger and drank my milkshake and watched the trucks go by on Highway 75. Always top entertainment in Huntsville to watch the trucks go by. I'd been there about 20 minutes when the phone rang. Any of you from a very small town know that, at least it used to be, everybody in town knew everybody else's voice. And Mary Sue Stramler was this girl's name, and she put her hand over the receiver. She said, Dan, it's Pastor Lott, and he does not sound to be in a very ministerial frame of mind. And so I quickly grabbed the phone, and it was true because Pastor Lott was talking through his teeth, which indicated he was angry. He said, young brother, have you heard our radio station any time in the last 20 minutes? I said, no, Pastor Lott. I admit I told a white lie. I said, there's a long line here at the Dairy Queen, and I hadn't had an opportunity to get back. He said, well, you get back and fix it, and you were fired. Click. Believe you me, I jumped like a man stabbed with a hat pin, got back in the mobile unit, turned on the radio station, and there was Pastor Lott's itinerant preacher brother saying, go to hell, go to hell, go to hell, go to hell. Now, any of you who've been in a small town know what 20 minutes of go to hell on the local radio station can do to your reputation. But fortunately for me, Pastor Lott had mercy on me, couldn't find anybody else to work 40 cents an hour, and so I remained on the job. I'm told in parentheses, by the way, that some other people around the country either have written that story or tell that story. I don't know, but it did happen to me. But I appreciate you riding with me through that because, among other things, it gives me an opportunity to get myself sort of settled up here. It also gives me an opportunity to make sure that you understand who and what I am. That I'm a lifetime reporter. It's the only thing I ever dreamed of wanting to do ever since I was a small child. I'm not an academic. I'm not a scholar. The late Ed Murrow was maybe the last scholar correspondent we had. I'm a working reporter. And what you see here, what I am, what I have been, is a reporter who got lucky. Very, very lucky over the years. So I want to cover a lot of ground with you about talking about the future of news. Can it speak truth to power? The importance of a fiercely independent journalism and the future of media. I've never liked the word media. I prefer the word press because the First Amendment talks about the press. It doesn't talk about media, but I've given it up. We'll talk about media. I mentioned to you as we began that the three things, if you don't walk out of here with anything else tonight, I want you to say, if somebody says, what did Dan Rather talk about? The three things that are most important to me, to have you understand, you don't have to agree with me. You may not agree with me. I'm wrong about a lot of things, a lot of time. But is corporatization, politicalization, and the trivialization of news. I consider to be American journalism in its best traditions. Traditional journalism, as we know it, is under siege. And I think it's in crisis. Now, this is not, do I think it's in crisis for those of us who are in journalism? I do think that. It's not a plea for understanding this because it's an issue for journalism and journalists. This, I know, I try to be careful about certitude, but this I know is important to our beloved country. Now, the corporatization of media, I'm talking here about the consolidation of the major mass media means of distribution. Roughly at least 80% of the mass media distribution in this country now is controlled by no more than 6 companies, large international conglomerates. Frankly, I think 4 is the more accurate figure, but to err on the side of conservatism and being conservative about it, 6 companies control 80% of the mass media distribution in the country. I equate it, this may not be a fair one, but I equate it a bit to what's happened to the banks. The banks got ever bigger, big banks bought smaller banks, and as we went along the way, we wound up with a country where a few major banks pretty much controlled our financial system. Now, whether you think that analogy works or not, some version of that has happened with news. And that has led in no small ways, and I think in ways without being patronizing, but because I've been on the inside of journalism for all of my adult life and part of my childhood, has helped to lead to the politicalization of news. And there is a connection between the growth of the big corporate ownership of most of the mass media means of distribution and the power, basically the power in Washington, although to a certain degree, with state legislatures as well. And that in turn, I think is no small factor in leading to the trivialization of so much in news today, the dumbing down and sleazing up of what we see on the news. Now, the crisis of the decline in what I call quality news of integrity, and this, and I think you'll agree if you stop and think about it, whether you agree with me about other things or not, the disturbing trend of corporate and political influence of the news demands that we think about it. And after we think about it, my own personal opinion, I think it leads to a need for media reform to become an immediate national priority. Now, that means a national priority with you and with me. It starts with we the people. Keep in mind that democracies and a free people cannot survive, much less thrive, without a free and truly independent, fiercely independent when necessary, press. Think about that for just a second. And let me suggest to you for your consideration that a truly free an independent press, again, fiercely independent when necessary, is part of the red beating heart of democracy. This is why I say to you, it's bigger than journalists, bigger than journalism. It's a societal problem of what's happening with our news. One example, did you know that there are over 10,000 newspaper jobs lost in the past 18 months? There's some estimates as high as 20,000. The newspaper business, as we have known it, is in virtually a free fall. Now, there's a real risk that the decoupling of news and advertising, which has been going on for some time, spell the end of journalism, especially local coverage, unless we take bold action on several fronts. And I want to outline some of my own questions of what might be that bold action. Let me start with an idea that is neither original nor profound. The question of whether we should recommend to President Obama that he establish a White House Commission on Public Media to provide recommendations and a roadmap for the future of public media and independent, truly independent reporting. I recognize that within journalism, there'll be plenty of people who have a lot of questions about establishing any White House Commission on public media. But keep in mind, we've had White House commissions and other such commissions on such things as the automobile industry, for example. The banking industry is another. So I throw it out there for whatever it may be worth, but I personally encourage the President to establish this White House Commission on Public Media. I don't commit myself to whatever they come up with, but I think the idea of treating this seriously, and getting something to stop the skid, to relieve the siege of American journalism. If it is not to be done at the White House level, perhaps it could be done at some other level. The Carnegie Institute, at least twice over the period of my lifetime, has done something akin to this, that is, looked at the press and made recommendations, not demands, recommendations of what reforms could be made and how we can better ensure the growth rather than the decline of quality news of integrity. Now, taking action requires doing two things at once, which is never easy. Save the craft of journalism and the brilliant, dedicated journalists still on the beat, still working, while at the same time encouraging new business models. Journalism is in almost desperate need of a new business model. And let me pause and say that for those who are still operating news outlets, and particularly those who lead and own, for the most part, the big international conglomerates that I mentioned earlier that own most of our mass media distribution, I think there needs to be, they probably, might not listen to me, but there needs to be a request to them. I would prefer to call it a plea, to think about turning their news operations. Keep in mind, these big corporations have many other interests. News is generally a very small part of what they do. To operate it, at least in part, as a public trust in the public interest, not solely in the interest of making money and making money only. I think that would be helpful to try to start a dialogue with them, and perhaps it's something that the commission that I mentioned earlier could try to develop further. But we're talking about that taking action requires two things at once. Save the craft of journalism, and the journalists who are still in it, so dedicated, want to stay in it, but are asking themselves, am I going to be able to stay in it? And if I do stay in it, can I make a living? While at the same time encouraging new business models. If we do nothing more than stand back and just hope that innovation alone will solve the journalism crisis, we run the risk that, among other things, our best trained journalists will lose their jobs and will leave the profession forever, and we will be the poorer for it. We have to help struggling old media while at the same time enabling the new. It is not an either-or situation. Like any complex problem, There's no single solution. There's much produced from discussion of innovative business models. Journalism schools, in some cases, are stepping forward, stepping out, doing some great research, and in some cases, they are convening conferences of their own to discuss the problem. There is more cooperation among news outlets as they consider the peril that they are in. There are the promising online news ventures that are popping up regularly, and there are creative efforts to monetize journalism on the web. But one thing is sure. Changes in public policy and in public attitudes will prove integral to addressing what I've called the journalism crisis. As I began, I talked about one of the things that good journalism at its best can and must do for a free and independent people, and that is speak truth to power. I was reminded, I covered the White House for 10 years for CBS News, through the Johnson, Nixon, and some of the Ford administrations. Lyndon Johnson, who took over from President Kennedy after his assassination in 1963, ran for president on his own in 1964. That's the year he beat Barry Goldwater, you may recall. After he got into office, the Vietnam War escalated. By 1967, it was pretty obvious that the war was not going the way that President Johnson and others had been telling us. And President Johnson was very much concerned about what this was doing to his political reputation. Let me pause and say I have great respect for President Johnson and his family, and great respect for what he created in the way of the Great Society. But he was very worried about public opinion really flooding away from him and his administration as regards the Vietnam War. He changed press secretaries. This is frequently the case with presidents, that when they get in trouble, they change the press secretary. And he brought up a man from Texas who had been working for the late Governor Connally, George Christian. George Christian became one of, if not the best White House press secretary in the time that I was there. But he brought George Christian up from Texas. George was a big, hulking Texan who spoke in a kind of slow drawl. And he came in and he said to President Johnson, Mr. President, you didn't get in this condition overnight. I can't get you out overnight. I'm a press guy, I'm a public relations guy, but I'm not a miracle worker. So what I want you to do, just do me a favor, just give me one thing right off the bat. Tell me one thing that's really bugging you, and let me get on that and try to solve it, and we'll go from there. President Johnson, who had huge hands, almost leapt from his desk. He poked George in the chest, and he said, I'll tell you, George, what? He said, every time I turn around, somebody either has in print, has on the radio, or has on television, that I said during the 1964 campaign, I, President Johnson, said, I will not send Asian boys, will not send American boys to do what Asian boys should be doing for themselves. He said, George, I never said it. It's a lie, but it's one of those things that's taken hold. Christian said, okay, Mr. President, I got it. Let me see what I can do. Within a few days, as Christian later told the story, he brought back to President Johnson a huge stack of printed material, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and Report, newspaper from all over the country, AP. Every one of them quoted the president directly as saying, I will not send American boys to do what Asian boys should do for themselves. And the president leaned back in his chair, said, George, I'm surprised at you, man of your experience. Forgive my language here, but this was the president's language. He said, you know how them some bitches lie. They make up quotes. They pipe the quotes. They put things down in print. Christian said, I know, Mr. President, but I just want you to know that it's a huge problem. He said, that I know, George. Christian said, let me work on it. About 10 days went by, and Christian came in to see the president and said, Mr. President, I want you to listen to something. He had an old-fashioned tape recorder. Remember, this is about 1967, maybe early 68, one of these old boxes. He said, now, Mr. President, I don't want you to get mad at me. I just want you to listen to what is on this audio tape. He pressed the audio tape, this box about this size, and there was the unmistakable voice of President Lyndon Johnson saying, I will not send American boys to do what Asian boys should be doing for themselves. The president used these huge bear-like hands, and he almost crushed the videotape machine. He whacked it. He said, George, I'm surprised at you. You know how them sumbitches use those little razor blades and they cut things up? and they paste things together. I'm telling you that I never said it. George said, Mr. President, I got you, I understand, I'll continue working on it. A little while later, they were at the White House theater where they show the president movies, and I think as one of President Johnson's favorites was, of course, the Alamo. They showed the Alamo or something. And Christian leaned over to him at one point and said, Mr. President, when this is over, I'd appreciate if you could stay over. We'll clear the room, but if you could stay over with me for just a few minutes here. And the President said, sure, George. So the movie played, everybody went out, and George said, Mr. President, there's nobody here except myself, you, and the projectionist. So the lights went down, and there, up on the screen, was Lyndon Johnson standing on the bumper of the presidential limousine in a dark street corner, I think Philadelphia, saying, I will not send American boys to do what Asian boys are doing themselves. The lights came up, and the president turned around and said, damn, George, you sure that's me? Well, naturally, I tell the story hoping you would laugh, but also there's some seriousness in that speaking truth to power, informing the powerful as well as those who put the powerful in office, has a long tradition in American journalism. When I say American journalism is under siege, in peril, in my word, in crisis, and that journalism of the sort that is practiced in truly free societies is part of the red beating heart of democracy, it's that kind of thing I'm talking about, not that particular anecdote, but the duty, the responsibility of saying things about the powerful when the powerful don't want to hear it and or have been denying it. That one definition of news, it's not original with me, but I like this definition of news. One definition of news is what people need to know. It is important for free people to know that somebody somewhere, and particularly somebody somewhere in power, doesn't want them to know. That's news. All the rest is pretty much advertising. Now, I've spoken at least more than my piece here, and I recognize we wanted to get out around 7:30. So if you don't mind, what I will do is back off here, maybe take a sip of water, and I'll be glad to take your questions. Thank you very much.
So we have microphones at these two corners, and if you want to come up and get ask a question, that would be great. In the meantime, let me just mention that on August 16th and 19th, here we're having the Forum on Communications and Society on this very issue, Models for Preserving American Journalism. So there are brochures at PEPCI and on our website. So is nobody going to ask a question? Well,
I have a simple question. I'm not going to go.
okay.
I can talk loud.
That's right.
Please identify yourself.
Stephen Edlis. I usually get to ask one or two questions. As a journalist, I'd be interested to know how powerful photojournalism is as opposed to print journalism. And I specifically recall there has been some questions, certain pictures should not have been published recently. Photojournalism, very powerful. How does that relate?
Right. Well, I include photojournalism when I say print. Perhaps I should add photojournalism in my own mind when I say print photojournalism. Photojournalism, whether it be still photographs, film, or videotape, are a powerful way of conveying information and news. In some ways, on some days, that a photograph or a series of what we call in television pictures that wiggle can tell a story even more powerfully than the written word or somebody narrating the spoken word. The late Eric Severide, who was a mentor of mine, he worked at CBS News for a long time, was one of Ed Murrow's boys, once said, "It is true that sometimes one picture is worth 1,000 words." But he added, there are times when just the right words are worth 1,000 pictures. That we need it all. And I've worked with many really brave, intelligent, and extremely talented photojournalists over the years. And I did not mean to exclude photographs when we talked about it. That the business of doctoring photographs, which has been with us since the still photograph era, before we even had film, and certainly before we had videotape, has always been a problem. Now, as far as publishing, what should be published, what shouldn't be published, I'm not going to kid you. I'm not going to cut it. Try to tell you that basically I am of the school of published and be damned, which is to say, if you've got it, you think it's news, you think it's something important that people should know, then publish it. Having said that, I don't want to be completely dogmatic about it. An example case that occurs to me, that if you're working at a local television station, which I have done, and you come across some horrible accident in which family members have been killed, I have myself thought twice and sometimes kept them off the air out of sensitivity to the family. But I think that's a different thing than what you're talking about. I mean, once you get into censoring, however the censorship happens, self-censorship or otherwise, it's the proverbial slippery slope. So mine is, look, it'll be controversial. Yes, you may catch hell about it. And if so, you have to face the furnace and take the heat. But if you decide that it's something that adds to the public information about something that's important, and you have it, then don't hold it back.
Mr. Rather?
Yes, keep in mind I can't see the lights, but
I'm over here
yes,
with
sir.
Mike. My name is John Corey. I'm formerly with the CBS affiliate in San Francisco, and I want to go on the record and say that I was embarrassed, and many of my colleagues were embarrassed by your unfortunate exit from CBS.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
As a lifetime reporter, I think it's an interesting paradox that you are now in front of and at the center of a very important story that will potentially speak truth to power, not only in Washington, but also in the media centers of New York, pardon the phrase. I'm wondering if you feel you will be able to report on this story, and if so, how you will be able to maintain the objectivity to do so.
I want to be certain I'm clear. You're talking about the court case in which I'm involved.
Yes.
In. Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for the compliment. I'm unworthy of that, but I do appreciate it very much. And I hope you'll understand that when one is in the middle of a court action such as this, that one needs to abide by the judge's instructions. And there's very little I can say about it in a forum such as this, and very little I am going to say about it. When I say I don't report on this, I sometimes, after a court appearance, am asked a question and answer the question. But I think at the core of what you're driving at is, can you be objective? Can a reporter be objective when the reporter is emotionally involved in any way in the story? And I would say to you that basically depends on the reporter. I recognize this is not a very good answer to you, but I hope you will understand that in the lawsuit, this is a lawsuit in which it will be 2 years in September, that it's, for me personally, it is something I am alone by myself. I knew going in that it was going to be a long, hard, expensive, odds-against fight. It remains that. But despite what our adversaries at law said in the beginning, that this was totally without merit, going to be dismissed immediately, we're coming up 2 years. We're still standing, still fighting, and when I can say something about it more than that, I will. Again, thank you very much.
Mr. Rather, my name's Larry Gelman, and I was a reporter at the CBS TV affiliate in Cincinnati. You were my hero at the time.
Oh, come on.
I was in TV news for 7 years, and I realized I would never be able to rise to your standard, so I got in the investment business, and I thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Because I wouldn't be in Aspen asking you this question if I had stayed. But I did want to go back to what you were talking about regarding truth to power, because my biggest concern today, particularly on television news, is the peripheral and almost non-existent role that the truth seems to be playing. It has now become a refined political tactic, it seems to me, to spread lies, knowing they're lies, comfortable in the knowledge that if you go on one of the cable outlets, that there will be minimal, if any, fact-checking, and that their ultimate goal is not really to enlighten or promote the truth, but rather to create a food fight where they can get people from either side to yell and scream and vilify each other on the air without even a semblance of fact-checking. And I wanted to ask you, A, if you agree with that assessment, and B, if you do, to what do you attribute it?
A, I agree with it. Again, I don't want to be overly general in response. There are exceptions to it. But when I talk about the trivialization of the news and the politicalization of the news and the big corporatization of the news and how those things are intertwined, that's part and parcel of what I was talking about. That my phrase, quality news of integrity, has to do with reporters and news operations seeing themselves operating a public trust in the public interest and trying as best as is humanly possible to be honest brokers of information, to get at the truth or as close to the truth as is humanly possible, and then tell it without fear or favor, to play no favorites, to present the news as straight as it possibly can. Unfortunately, this tradition of the American press, which really grew to maturity in the immediate post-World War II years, it began somewhat before then, post these years, has gone in far too many places, has gone out of fashion. And when we talk about let's get together, let's have an ongoing conversation about where we go from here. Right now, the kind of thing you're talking about, the kind of great tradition of the best of American journalism, of trying as hard as you humanly can to do what I described to you, is on the decline. If you make the graph, it's going down. So the question in my mind is, we've got to stop the downward movement and then find our way back to higher ground. I don't want to sound, like I'm trying to preach or convert anyone here. Journalism, I practice the journalism of joy. I've been happy in journalism, even in the toughest times. Happy I was in it. And I do care passionately about the news and about the integrity of news and the great American journalism traditions. And look, at my age and stage, I have thankfully reached the point where I don't have to kiss up to anybody. And what a wonderful feeling it is. That so much of what is on television today, again, there are exceptions, so much of what's on television, to a large extent on radio, cast as, quote, news, is not news. It's designed to be, and in very large degree, it is entertainment. As entertainment values have virtually almost completely swamped news values in tsunami fashion, that more and more programs, as I say, are designed to be entertainment. Now, you mentioned something before of the political and dedicated ideological operatives have learned to, quote, play the press, if you will. This extends to the internet to no small degree. The internet is something we may discuss as we go along. I hope we'll get into it because I'm a believer in the internet. However, this business of, listen, you put a lie out there, an untruth, you smear somebody with, if you desire to do so, virtually with no accountability for partisan, political, or your own ideological reasons, with the idea that you create a virus. You say it often enough, you get it spread to the internet, to radio and television, and it becomes a believed, quote, truth, when it is in fact an untruth. And when I talk about the need for quality journalism of integrity, never been greater, part of it is to combat just what you described. Yes, sir.
My name is Marn Obernauer, and in this context I would describe myself as the proud father of two sons who are both journalists. So I am very interested in the future of this profession. And you just touched on the question I'm about to ask, which is you suggested that there ought to be new business models for journalism. Could you comment on the potential and the dangers of the internet, both for independent entrepreneurial journalists and for the more established journalistic organizations today?
Well, I'll do my best. That you already know where I stand as regards the internet in general. It's one of the great innovations, innovations of this or any other time in terms of getting not just news and information to people, but education, the arts, culture. Its potential is limitless. I think we are not at the stage where we've just scratched the surface with the internet, but not far beyond that. I'm not a seer. I can't see beyond the far horizon. But on the plus side, when it comes to news, the ability, particularly with local news, to have people contribute to community news, and for that matter, national news as well, is enormous, and I think on balance has been a plus up to now. My own concerns, and these are my own personal concerns, but I recognize they are shared by some people. One is what I mentioned, accountability. If there's a newspaper story, somebody owns the newspaper, somebody wrote the story, some editor okayed the story. On radio, somebody's voice is on it. On television, somebody's voice and face is on it. There is accountability. With the internet, on the one hand, nobody wants censorship. On the other hand, I'm disturbed, I think people are disturbed by the ability to put almost anything on it with no accountability, including if you just don't like your neighbor, you can put something on the internet that's outrageous, untrue, vile, ruins the neighbor's reputation, and unless you're really dedicated and perhaps you're lucky, you may never know who spread that story. I recognize I haven't given to you the solutions. I don't have the solutions to these kinds of problems. I do want to make it very clear that we need to be extremely careful about anything that would censor the internet, in the same way we need to be very careful about any censorship of any news operation or anything that professes into journalism. But with journalism, that we have the First Amendment, we have the guarantees of the First Amendment. At the same time, we have laws. We have libel and slander laws, for example, that we haven't yet developed. The law has not caught up with the internet as yet. Public policy has not caught up with the internet as yet. I think it's coming. I hope it comes quickly. Yes, ma'am.
I want to begin by just telling you that you were the first man that ever made me cry. And I was 10 years old, and I happened to be walking through the living room when I heard your voice tell this nation that John F. Kennedy had died. And your voice then became to me more important than any man's voice had ever been. I had lost my father when I was a baby. John F. Kennedy represented to me everything that a man should be. And when I heard you tell me that this nation had lost him, I then depended on your voice and your news reporting so I would know who to trust and what to trust in this world. I thank you for that. I thank you for being a man, a reporter, a journalist that we as everyday Americans could look up to and trust. I think that is a vital element of what is missing in this world today. My son graduated with a minor in journalism from the University of Utah. He was not able to find a job in journalism. He now works as an international exchange broker.
I think we need to get a question.
Yes. My question to you being, how do we encourage these young students, these young journalistic students, to pursue that when there is apparently no careers and opportunities for them to get a job in? I know you wanted us to write letters to encourage, but how do we fight that kind of big business?
Well, first of all, I'm deeply appreciative of what you said before, and obviously having been in Dallas and as part of the CBS News team that broke the news before it was officially announced that the president not only had been wounded but was dead, I deeply appreciate what you said. I'm unworthy of a lot of that. but I very much appreciate it. Now, as to your question, that I spoke with some high school journalism students before, and so I'm going to say to you, to pass along to your young, aspiring journalism friends, what I said to them. This may be a somewhat elevated, I hope, elevated version of it, but it is, first of all, to be a journalist now, perhaps more than ever, requires an absolute passion to do it. Journalism is one of those fields that if you do not burn with a hot, hard flame to do it, then you're probably not going to do it very well. The second thing is writing is the bedrock of the craft. And if you dream and if you're committed, if you burn with that hot, hard flame to do it, then commit yourself to making yourself an ever increasingly good writer. Because whether it's television, radio, the internet, you name it in news, that writing is the principal building base. Now, I recognize, as I've spelled out, this is an extremely difficult time for anyone to be an aspiring journalist. But this may sound a little corny, but it has been my experience, and all I can give you is the benefit of my experience, that if you're determined to do it, you'll find a way, even in the worst of economies, and this is, if not the worst, among the worst. That if your dream is to do it, you're committed to it, you'll find a way. That's the best I can do. I want to pause. I recognize there's some other questions, but we were talking about what's happened to the great traditions of American journalism. One of them has been really first-class foreign correspondence. It's now called international news. Why they decided to call it international news rather than foreign news, I don't know. But nonetheless, at the very time that we need more, better international reporting, we're getting less and less. Bureaus close, even the best of our news operations, even the best newspapers, the best television outlets, close bureaus, lay off foreign correspondents, shrink the news hole for international news. A prime example of that would be the two wars we now fight in Afghanistan and Iraq. Have you noticed? I bet you have. That news of Afghanistan, where we have a really vicious combat going on in parts of the country, particularly Helmand province down in the southwest part of the country where I've been myself, it winds up on page 14, page 16 at best. It doesn't make anybody's evening news or cable news nearly as often as it should. The kind of investigative reporting that should be brought to war profiteering virtually doesn't exist. There's some exceptions to that. Analysis, context, background reporting, just to pick Afghanistan as an example, is little and very far between. That, if you forgive me, I don't mean this in any self-serving way, but I've been going to Afghanistan since just after the Soviets invaded in late 1979. And this may be the decisive year in Afghanistan. With wars, it's always hard to tell. But this could be the decisive year. And we have yet to have a true national debate about Afghanistan that lays out the enormity of what we're trying to undertake there. Don't misunderstand me. I am not saying we shouldn't have undertaken it. I'm not saying that we shouldn't continue to do what we can. But not posing as any expert, but presenting myself to you as a reporter who has walked the ground. I do think about Afghanistan. We either go big and go long, or we go home. What I mean by that is we have to understand that even achieving the minimum goals of our mission to Afghanistan will take, in my opinion, and it's not just my opinion, a lot of people who fight the wars there and diplomats there will tell you much the same thing. We're talking 7 to 15 years. It's not a matter of this year or next year. 7 to 15 years. And a considerably increased dedication of money and blood. That's what it's going to take. To have any other discussion, one can argue about how many years it's going to take, but it's going to be a long, hard struggle. Now, first of all, is this what we want to do? As a people, as a society, we haven't had that discussion. Is it what we want to do? And number two, can we do it? Even if we decide it's what we want to do, can we afford it in terms of money? Can we afford it in terms of the blood? Again, I caution you, I'm not saying to you that I think we ought to get out. I am saying to you that I think we ought to have this national debate. When we talk about coverage, it gives me a headache sometimes how little coverage there is. It's, you remember that movie, And the Rains Came? Well, and the rains came, but perhaps the hail will not be far behind.
Okay, I think what we're going to...
In the enterprise in which I'm now engaged, which is a weekly news program called Dan Rather Reports on HDNet, because of my strong feelings about this, that we have committed ourselves. Look, we're relatively small. We have limited resources, but enough resources. We've committed ourselves to doing the best job on television about reporting on Afghanistan. And there are bigger news organizations, more important news organizations with much more resources that I hope will come around to the conclusion that we do need to have the national debate that I just described to you. We do need to have context, background, and analysis of Afghanistan rather than just having it on page 17 and almost invisible on television as a whole. Forgive me for that soliloquy, but thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to, in view of the rain, we're going to just have to cut it off. But thank you, Dan Rather. Let's have a hand.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. The time went by quickly for me. Thank you. I'd be very interested.